Welcome to Aspen Ideas. I'm Mike Allen from Axios, and we're going to be talking the future of conservatism, from Reagan to Trump, and the part that a couple of our panelists are waiting for, and beyond. Before I introduce our guests, Charlie Sykes, who you know needs no introduction, set a record today at an earlier taping. Charlie, go ahead and drop your record.
Should I do it as a safe for work version of all of this?
Please.
So we did a podcast, Bulwark podcast, with Rick Wilson, with a reaction to how the Democrats performed in the debate last night, and I think we did set a record for the number of F-bombs that were dropped during this. Those of you that know Rick know that he can be a little bit salty, but this was so much that even he, about two-thirds of the way through, said, "Wow, I'm dropping a lot of F-bombs." So it gives you an idea.
We always start with the news, two momentous Supreme Court cases today. We're just going to take 2 seconds with each one. The first one that Mona Charen has one thought about. High Court keeps citizenship question on hold. In the census case, the president, stand by, the president has tweeted about the Supreme Court ruling, and he's going to ask the Supreme Court to delay the census as long as it takes. So it is the 2020 census. He's asked them to delay it as long as it will take. Mona, you have one thought about whether or not the census form should ask if we're a citizen.
Right. So it's the legal questions, especially Supreme Court opinions, take a long time to analyze in detail. But I will just say that it is a bit refreshing that the Supreme Court slapped down this completely pretextual case that the administration made for why they wanted to include a question about citizenship on the census. The reason that they gave, which was risible, was that they needed it to better enforce the Voting Rights Act.
And the second case, and you know it's momentous because the New York Times says it is in its lead, the Supreme Court bars challenges to partisan gerrymandering, 5-4 vote. The court's more conservative members in the majority. The court closed the door to claims of gerrymandering. And Charlie, I know you have one thought about that.
Well, actually, I have two thoughts about it. One is that I understand the concern about gerrymandering, and I think it is a real threat to the future of our democracy in terms of the way that the system has been rigged. On the other hand, I was impressed by the judicial restraint in this decision, where the courts decided that, okay, it is a wrong, but we cannot wade into that particular thicket. And I think that as conservatives, it is kind of refreshing to see judges exercise that kind of restraint, although I understand why people are going to be disappointed when the court essentially saying, let's let politicians who have created this problem solve it. But the courts are not going to rescue us from everything.
Amen. All right, Brett Stevens, to set the tone here, set the table here for our conversation about the future of conservatism. When your boss, James Bennett, editorial page editor of the New York Times, announced your appointment at the New York Times, a columnist is an appointment. When you were appointed, he said that you were honest. Now, being honest as a conservative at the New York Times isn't always easy.
Okay.
First of all, that's not true. Your premise is mistaken. The evidence for that is the joy with which so many readers of the New York Times have received my twice-weekly pearls of wisdom, which is to say that the Times has never stood in the way of my offering a view. My first column led to a petition, an online petition signed by, last I checked, 40,000 people demanding that I be fired. So it was a refreshing feeling. You should all try it one day. And the great thing is, there was never a question of that happening. And the Sulzberger family stood by me because they understand that you cannot have a newspaper that is simply going to be bullied by the furies of Twitter and succumb to that sort of pressure, which, by the way, has not been true across much of the rest of the media. So I've tried to be honest as a conservative. I've tried to be honest, most of all, as an individual, and call things as I see them, which has occasionally meant that I have agreed with things that the president has said or done. I don't think of myself as a sort of mindless, reflexive, never-Trumper. But it's also allowed me to articulate a vision of what conservative principles ought to be that is very different from what the Trumpian wing of the party, which is now 85% of it or so, believes it ought to be. I think at the end of the day, in order to have a healthy republic, in order to have a healthy democracy, we need a morally sound and intellectually honest conservative movement. And quite frankly, at the moment, I don't think we really have one, except for a handful of voices who have stood by the principles of classical conservatism, which is another way of saying classical liberalism, that I found inspiring when I was coming of age in the 1980s, and I think that's true for my fellow panelists as well.
And what do you think needs to happen for those voices to be the dominant voices of conservatism once again?
Well, this is depressing because I wish I could say that, simply by the force of my argument and the winning nature of my charm, people would come over, but clearly that isn't working. Look, Trump is the beneficiary of the fact that we have not had any great setback or catastrophe during his presidency. There have been aspects of his presidency which to me are revolting, most of all our treatment of immigrants at the border, but that hasn't been a kind of a central crisis in the way that the Great Recession or the Iraq War were crises for the George W. Bush administration, or in its own way the Iran hostage crisis was for the Carter administration. So effectively, I think in order for us to be heard again, Trumpism has to visibly fail. And when you have an unemployment rate that's 3.6 or 3.7%, and we are broadly speaking at peace with the rest of the world, that isn't going to happen. I would just say that I remember when Erdogan was seen as a successful leader of Turkey because you had a benign economic currents, and when Hugo Chavez was seen as a successful leader of Venezuela for the same reason. I think we are storing trouble, and that trouble at some point will haunt us.
And very quickly, what would have to happen then for Trumpism to fail?
Well, effectively, the results of a shambolic style of administration, of the perpetual incompetence and failures of simple execution of policy, and the consequences of the policy themselves would have to, in some manifest way, fail. That hasn't quite happened yet, but we are like characters in some Minnesota lake skating over very thin ice, and by some miracle, it hasn't broken yet. At some point, the ground beneath our feet, I suspect, is becoming very brittle and very thin, and what lies below is cold and deep.
Robert Doar, when you were named the 12th president of AEI, Bob Costa did a piece in the Washington Post, and the headline says, AEI names Robert Doar as new president as conservative movement tries to find its way in Trump era. Exactly on point for us. How are conservatives doing?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's not entirely unusual that the conservative movement or people that hold conservative principles are out of whack with either the mainstream Republican Party or a Republican president. Eisenhower, Nixon, George H.W. Bush to some extent. I take kind of a longer view of this, and I think that what I want at AEI and what I want our scholars to do is to focus on specific issues and as Brent said, call them as we see them, and call them strongly and call them aggressively. And I think with that kind of work and effort, we'll regain the momentum, or we'll contribute to the public debate in a positive way. I think it's important to stay out of the name calling and the kind of vitriolic behavior that happens in this country, and that's what AEI is going to be about.
And Robert Doar, AEI is all about free people and free markets. Which of those at this moment do you think is more threatened?
Ooh, that's a good one. I would say free markets in the extent that the thing that we're most concerned about is the free trade issues. That is the area where the conservatives at AEI are troubled in the most extreme way. I also need to just say that in the area that I focus on, which is sort of welfare policy and public assistance programs and moving people to work and personal responsibility, down below the radar screen, this administration has taken actions that are controversial and difficult, but they are consistent with a kind of more right-of-center or conservative approach to those programs. And that's, as I've watched it unfold, been gratifying to me because I believe in employment and personal responsibility and emphasis on family. And I also should say, while I do not want to talk about the specific decisions, the members of the court on the right side of the balance, I think, are acquitting themselves very well, and it's a very vibrant, compelling, not in sync with each other world, and they're in some ways setting an example for how to preserve a limited government, conservative, separation of powers. And the last thing I would say is federalism. I think that so much that's happening that I'm most familiar with is at the state and city level, and there are conservatives and Republicans and people that think the way we do who are doing good work in that terrain and are in the battle in an unencumbered way from all the turmoil that's at this level. And that's another area that we will focus on at AEI.
Mona Chair, and the buzz all around campus today has been about the debate. And I'd love your thoughts about how Republicans and conservatives respond to the Democratic primary, like how it's going to affect the future of the party and of the movement. And to tee that up, you had a column last month that said, should Democrats avoid female candidates? So how do you see the Democratic race playing into the fates of Republicans and conservatives?
Well, somewhat to my dismay, I have seen from the Democrats real encouragement for the Trumpian Republicans. Charlie had a good piece about this in Politico. The Democrats are presenting themselves as a radical left-wing party from the point of view of middle-of-the-road voters, even voters who are open to the idea of voting for a Democrat. They're not going to be so tempted if they think it means what Pete Buttigieg says, which is he wants to pack the Supreme Court, what Kamala Harris says, which is that she's going, and Beto O'Rourke, they want to rule by executive order, which is unconstitutional, or what eliminating the Electoral College, and so on and so forth. They have responded to Trump's rule-breaking and norm-breaking by norm-breaking of their own. And I think that loses them one of their main appeals to the American people, that this is unacceptable and that we do need a return to the respect for the rule of law. Biden has, we'll see what happens tonight, but Biden has so far resisted that urge, and he's been successful with the voters, at least in terms of polling. I think that most of the Democratic Party, though, is playing right into the hands of the Trumpians.
And Mona, what is your elevator answer to the question, should Democrats avoid female candidates?
No. The notion that they have to avoid female candidates because what 2016 proved is that Americans aren't ready for a female president is ridiculous. Hillary Clinton lost her own popularity all on her own because, I mean, her standing when she left the position of Secretary of State was she had something like a 66% approval rating. And over the next several months and years, it proceeded to fall and fall and fall into the basement because she lied about her server. She was high-handed and imperious about it, and she sacrificed people's confidence.
Charlie, I'd love for you to pick up where Brett left off. You had a column in The Guardian, Conservatism in Eclipse in the Age of Trump. What has to happen for the eclipse to turn into sunrise? What's the opposite of an eclipse?
Yeah, well, the problem with that is what does conservatism mean right now? I mean, it's been drained of a lot of the meaning that we thought that it had. It's obviously not about limited government. It's not about free markets. It's not about fiscal responsibility. It's not about an emphasis on personal character and integrity, or the rule of law. 5 minutes ago, you had conservatives who cared about things like the deficit, who really did think that free markets were one of the great engines of economic development, and where are we at right now? So the conservative movement, at the end of the day, there's a big, the question is whether or not it's going to be, the conservative movement will be populist, nativist, reactionary, and illiberal, or whether it will be reformist, inclusive, reactionary, and liberal. Now, it's going to be reactionary either way. It's going to be reactionary because really the beating heart of conservatism is going to be opposition to leftism. And this is what Mona was, I think, getting at right now. The one thing that will unite conservatives is if Democrats basically say, yes, we do want a total government takeover of healthcare, and we will ban private health insurance. We will openly consider confiscating guns. We're not only for a woman's right to choose, we won't want taxpayer funding for abortion at any time whatsoever. We want to pack the courts. We really do think that we are going to give away lots of free stuff. We're going to give away free college education, free daycare, and somebody else is going to pay for all of that. So that is going to unite the conservative movement. But, and so what is it actually going to take? I share Brett's, who knows when the fever breaks. There are a lot of ideas that are in turmoil right now, but I think
Just tick those off, the ideas that excite you.
Well, the ideas that I think used to animate conservatism, which were these classical liberal views, the views of the founders, free markets, free people, all of those things. There's a lot of turmoil about what conservatives are going to come up with, and it's a really healthy debate, I think. But the real shock, I think, of the era of Trump has been the extent to which it turned out that the conservative movement, related, separated from conservative idea, that the conservative movement was not driven by ideas or by principles, but by tribalism and by what has become a cult of personality. Right now, what is conservatism other than what Donald Trump says it is? When he leaves the stage, I do think there will be a moment where, and some of the issues that we'll still have to litigate, we'll still have to talk about whether, populist versus, liberal versus illiberal, but I do think we'll get back to the business of actually debating these ideas, because this is one thing that I think a lot of us have a hard time understanding, is that watching conservatives abandon their principles because Donald Trump abandoned those principles, that the party that used to be defined by William F. Buckley and Edmund Burke and Ronald Reagan now is taking its cue from people like Sean Hannity and Dan Bongino.
Who's going to listen to a radio talk show?
And Steve Bannon.
I think that there's a little bit on us. On three issues at least, President Trump carried the day with people that we had counted on to support our view of the world. On free trade, he whomped us. On America's role in the world, I think, and on entitlements. And I think that it's not so, I think part of what's got to happen is that we have to refashion arguments for the principles related to those public policy issues and make them compelling and attractive to voters in the United States.
I agree with okay.
I concede that up to a point, but it's not like Donald Trump came as an ideological innovator. All the ideology was like whatever was from the rune stones of his mind communicated through the kind of...
Well, I hope I didn't say that, but yes.
What Trump succeeded because he communicated, he did two things. He funneled a great deal of inchoate anxiety into a style of politics which was a take-no-prisoner style of politics. I got one thing really wrong in 2016, which is I thought the only Republican who definitely couldn't win was Trump. It turned out, in hindsight, I think he was the only Republican who could, because he had the quality of anger and a certain kind of shamelessness that, or at least a kind of willingness to go there, so to speak, that the Republican Party needed in order to defeat a candidate like Hillary Clinton, who seemed to have everything, at least on paper, going for her. And there were aspects of that which were genuinely refreshing. I really think that we need a politically incorrect president, okay? There are all kinds of orthodoxies that have sort of silently taken hold of campuses and institutions that would have been radical 5 years ago and now are treated as a species of common morality. And all of that is, I think, to many of us, kind of, weird and dislocating and in some ways sort of
upsetting. But the problem with Trump isn't that he's politically incorrect. The problem is he's a 7-letter word that begins with the letter A. And
Moving in on Charlie's record.
You got a long way to go.
anyway.
Yeah.
Mona, there's something that's true of you that's not true of anyone else in this room. Something that's unique to you in this room. Okay. You got booed at CPAC, the conservative Woodstock do tell.
Well, it's not that I love being booed by audiences, so bear that in mind here today. One of the things that is distressing about this moment, and it goes beyond Trump himself and his personality and his flaws and your apt description, but it is that so rapidly the leading lights of the conservative world have fallen into line. They have abandoned their principles. They've abandoned things that they have stood for decades. You have the editors of the Wall Street Journal, fairly, second most prestigious newspaper in the country, would you say, Brett?
At the moment.
Where they can barely bestir themselves to say a single word of criticism of Trump, and they are thought leaders, and they used to be considered serious conservative ideologues, opinion makers. And now CPAC is a different story. CPAC has always had a slightly clownish cast to it. It's been a mix, some very serious people and some freak show types. Yeah, but still a lot of conservatives pay attention to it. And a couple of years ago, they invited me to speak, even though the rest of the roster of the whole conference was nothing but people who were Trump enthusiasts. And I thought, well, they must not be paying attention to what I've been writing, but they invited me, so I'll say what I think. And there were two things that I wanted to talk about. One was that the president had just endorsed, and therefore the Republican Party had just endorsed Roy Moore for Senate in Alabama. And the second thing was that the CPAC organizers had invited Marine Le Pen, niece of Marie Le Pen, as one of their keynote speakers. And so I will confess that I came loaded for bear and told them what I thought, and I knew it might not go over so well. What I did not know was that I would need an armed escort to leave the building. It was quite an experience, but I'm still very glad that I did it. It inspired people. I got tremendous response from liberals and conservatives around the country. So sometimes it's just liberating to be able to speak the truth.
So one of the little footnotes here is Mona is absolutely right that she inspired people. It's one of those just reminders that even one lone voice can actually have a ripple effect. And one of the people who was inspired by Mona taking that lonely stand was George Conway, who decided that maybe he ought to start speaking up. But the CPAC story is so representative of what's happened to the conservative movement. I spoke there in 2016, and it was overwhelmingly actually conservative. It was, and Donald Trump didn't even show up. He wouldn't come. It wasn't a safe enough space for him. And yet you fast forward 2017 and beyond, and it is basically just uniformly a Trump festival as well as French neo-fascists. But it has been the process that Jonah Goldberg, and I want to make sure I give him credit here, Jonah Goldberg is described as AEI's Jonah Goldberg, as watching Invasion of the Body Snatchers, as one conservative after another who had no illusions about who Donald Trump was, no illusions about his character or his fitness for office, suddenly decides, oh no, I need to become part of all of this. Resistance is futile. And I think that has been really a disorienting experience, I think, watching the conservative movement.
Years ago, I was interested, just in a kind of academic way, on the literature of totalitarianism, like the Hannah Arendts and Milos's and Orwell's of the world. And in the 1990s, when I was reading this, it seemed like a sort of an antiquarian interest because totalitarianism seemed to be a phenomenon of the past. One of the books that I read that I remember finding interesting was Czesław Milosz's The Captive Mind, which I really, if you guys go home and read one big book this year, make that your reading. And what it describes is the way in which a generation of Polish intellectuals, Milosz's intellectuals, came of age in the 30s and then lived through the war, became convinced Stalinists in the 1940s. And Milosz's insight is they didn't sort of turn from the Catholic Church to the Church of Stalin out of fear that they were going to be executed. They found sort of odd psychological pathways to give themselves over to a Stalinist dispensation that at some level they understood was revolting and despotic, but nonetheless they believed that it represented the future, that, as Charlie said, resistance is futile, that life is just a big joke anyway, so why not get in on it, that the duty of the intellectual is to sort of turn lemons into lemonade, one thing or another. And it's a great mind sort of offering a profound psychological analysis of what happened. And I have to say, looking at my fellow conservatives, including so many who were so outspoken against Trump all the way up until the second that he won, that a similar process seemed to take hold there. I think what the never-Trumpers, what so-called never-Trumpers do now, and one of the reasons why I always find myself weirdly reading articles about Bret Stephens and Charlie Sykes, who are totally irrelevant people, but we're nonetheless going to devote 2,000 words about them in, American Greatness or one of these weird journals. I think the reason we have this effect is that we serve as a kind of bad conscience for people who understand that there was an element of dishonesty in their conversion to the new faith.
Well, Brett, unpack that for us, because this phenomenon, I've watched this. There were people that were anti-Trump, then he won. Then they became anti-press. That was their safe space. Then they became anti-Trump, and now they're just pro-Trump. How does that happen?
In the same way that you go from a cigarette to alcohol, and the next thing you know, you're shooting up in your eyeballs, And look. Here's let me concede one point, okay, which is that opponents of Trump have not helped themselves by painting the Trump administration in the darkest possible terms, by the obsessive comparisons to fascism and totalitarianism, by the prediction that a Trump presidency was going to guarantee catastrophe. And a lot of them say, where's your catastrophe? The economy is roaring, and basically the world is fine, and the Gestapo has not yet knocked upon your door. Because the real problem with Trumpism isn't that it has led to a catastrophe. Actually, when you look at policy level, most of it is sort of standard issue Republican points plus crazy Twitter plus the unpredictability of Trump's impulsiveness. The real problem is that what we've had is a kind of a corrosion of manners and ethics and institutions, the effects of which I don't think will be felt for another decade. In fact, I can predict when they're going to be felt. They will be felt when the Democratic Party nominates and then elects its own version of a Donald Trump, and Republicans will say, how did this happen? Just as Democrats, some of them in this room, are wondering, how did we elect this philandering, disgusting, alleged rapist scoundrel to the presidency? Maybe it had something to do with what happened in 1998.
I'm going to follow up on that. And by the way, I also recommend the book. In late 2016, I think you gave a speech where you quoted that. And this was when I was still trying to think like, what the F just happened to us? I mean, what is going on? And reading that was kind of an oh shit moment. Okay, it is happening. And reading Hannah Arendt is in fact kind of is eye-opening. But I think part of it is also the way our politics and our culture have evolved. That people like us thought that politics was about ideas and about policies, and it's really not. It's about ideas. I mean, it's about identity. It's about attitude, and it's about belonging. And if you're a conservative, you are part of this family, this group. And, a lot of us think that we use our minds to determine what is true or what is false, and social psychologists will say, no, actually, the way the human mind is wired, we use our minds in order to strengthen our bonds to our tribe. We use it for motivated reasoning, to confirm our bias. We look for something that confirms it. And so here we are in the era of Trump, and to break with Trump is to break with the family, to break with the tribe. Obviously, you have the gigantic grifter class in the conservative movement who will go wherever the politics and the money might happen to be. But I also think that there is just that sort of mentality that we have seen in other societies. And this is my concern as a classical liberal. And I actually, part of me, and I debated this with George Will, maybe it's time to stop calling ourselves conservatives and go back to classical liberals. But he points out there's a branding problem there.
What's wrong with classical?
And he's wrong. Yeah, exactly. There's a branding problem with both words. But one of my main concerns, though, is that we take a lot of things for granted in our culture. I think what we've discovered is that a lot of the ideas that Robert and I thought were the center of conservatism was really very like a thin pie crust of the conservative movement, that they said it, but it wasn't there. The other thing we learned is that we are not immune from history. And this debate that's broken out about David Frenchism, not to get too much in, I mean, there is now a wing of the Trumpist right that is basically saying the real problem is, in fact, liberal democracy, liberal pluralistic democracy. When I say liberal, I mean small l. They are openly embracing European-style illiberalism. This is an extraordinary moment for the right. And I do think that for people who just simply assume that we go on and there's a reset and then we go back to normal, I think Brett's right. When one of the major political parties becomes dumber, meaner, and more disconnected with reality, that is going to have consequences for an entire generation.
Can I say something that is a little unusual for me, maybe very unusual for me, which is a critique of capitalism in this? Because I think we've been talking a lot about the intellectuals and about the elites and about politicians and their role, but we haven't talked about the people. And in a sense, this is a failure of all of us as citizens. And you have to ask, how did things get so off the rails? And one possible explanation is that we are so used to being catered to as customers. And we've come to take, and the capitalist system has certainly fulfilled our needs to an unbelievable degree. But we don't see it as our responsibility, as our burden, as our honor to fulfill the dreams of the founders and to build a good society and to be solid citizens and take a role in public life. Instead, we say we're going to sit back and pick channels and be catered to. And frankly, the Democrats last night were a perfect example of this. The pander fest was, was off the charts, and that kind of treatment of the voters as consumers is, I think, infantilizing, and it's one of the ways that you got this deformation of our politics that we see.
Quiero contestarte en español.
Mis amigos.
This is now called Hispandering.
Can I just pick up on something that Charlie said, which is, I think, really so important? I think the real divide in American politics today is not between, as it was during the Cold War, liberal and conservative. It's between liberal and illiberal. And unfortunately, I think Trumpism represents the capture of the Republican Party by an illiberal instinct and illiberal elements. Illiberal in its opposition to immigration and the tenets of the open society, to free trade, to an engaged concept of America leading a free world, and so forth and so on. But that contest is also taking place inside the Democratic Party. And there is a great deal of illiberalism, in my opinion, masquerading as progressivism in the Democratic Party. And it's like watching, I feel like I'm watching the other version of what happened to the Republican Party taking place among the Democrats themselves. I'll often make the case, I'll defend Joe Biden because, some of the accusations against him are sort of absurd and preposterous. And people, I look at Twitter sort of for morbid reasons of self-loathing and morbid fascination. And people say, who's this Bret Stephens to give advice to the Democratic Party? Well, I'm doing it because I really would love to vote for a reasonable Democratic candidate who can make America sane again, right? And the party is making it hard for me to do so. But I'm sort of on hands and knees
begging Democrats, don't give in to the same illiberalism, the cancel culture phenomenon that took over Republicans.
Basically what I think we're trying to say to the Democrats right now, and we're used to not being listened to by politicians, so this is not a new thing, is like, good, go ahead, light a candle in the darkness. But that doesn't mean pouring kerosene over your head and setting yourself on fire.
Speaking of setting ourselves on fire, I want to come back to the long view and the Constitution and the underpinnings of our society. I have some faith in those being able to carry us through. I think we've lived through 1968 and 1932 and 1862, and what we're having now is not anywhere really, in some ways, as bad as those years. And so we have a messy democracy. We have unpleasantness. We have a turmoil. But I think the Constitution and the rule of law will prevail.
Robert, picking up on Brett's point about the roaring economy. So you're a fellow in poverty studies, and in January 16, so well before Trump was nominated, you had an op-ed in the second most prestigious paper in America that was very prescient. The headline was, "The Big But Hidden U.S. Jobs Problem. Labor force participation remains alarmingly low." Bring us up to date.
It's gotten a little better. A hot economy is a great thing, and people are, as they say, coming off the sidelines in a way they weren't even then. It's not back to the peak in 2000, and that's where I'd like it to be. I think our country is stronger when Americans are working at rates closer to that. But the other that is one of the other elements of what's happening in the country is the strength of the economy is quite remarkable. In the area that I cover, even with a slightly down labor force participation, child poverty, no matter how you measure it, and it's a low threshold, so I recognize that, is at its lowest point ever. And for African Americans, for Hispanics, for everybody. And that blunts some of the upset or anger that could occur when we have what's going on in Washington take place. And so we've gotten a little better. I happen to still believe that there is an element of our public assistance world that is only focused on providing assistance and not focused on helping people get a job. And that was one of the things that the Trump administration appointees have been trying to do. But
back to something what Brett said and trying to connect the dots here, given how strong the economy is, our politics are so ugly and so divided. What are they going to look like? How ugly will it get if, in fact, the ice does break? Can you imagine having these debates with 7, 8, 9% unemployment rate, especially when both sides have decided that they hate the other side, that the other side wants to destroy America, and all that counts is #winning.
Okay, so on hashtags, Charlie, you tell Republicans, don't just tweet about it, do something. Do what?
Republicans? Well, I think Republicans at some point, I still, this is how irrelevant I am. I still am hoping that there's going to be a primary challenge to Donald Trump so that there is a voice for Republicans to say, we are not all on board with all of this. Now, do I think it will succeed? No, I don't think it's going to succeed. But every once in a while, it's worthwhile to put your hand up and say, I'm not going along with this. I'm not willing to abandon everything. I'm not willing to embrace every hypocritical flip-flop that the Trumpian right demands of me. So, and again, that requires a willingness to be a little bit contrarian, and I think we've seen from the polls how vanishingly rare that has become.
It's like
just briefly, it's like France. The resistance wasn't much, but the myth of the resistance created the new France.
Right. And there's a great line from Alexander Solzhenitsyn who said, "Let the lie come into the world, let it even triumph, but not through me."
So we're about to get the hook, and so I'm going to let Brett Stevens leave us on an uplifting point. You had a recent column.
It's a quote Woody Allen. It's always darkest before it goes absolutely black.
That was Mao.
So you had a recent column with the headline, "How Trump Wins Next Year."
Oh, you really want a depressing closer. Look, there is a phenomenon. Trump has to be seen in a global context, and that is the context of Brexit. It's the context of
Marine Le Pen being the number 2 finisher. It's the context of a neo-fascist party now being the 3rd largest in Germany, the context of Bolsonaro in Brazil, and this is the context of the resurgent populism throughout the world. And I think the resurgence of populism has to do at some deep level with a failure of the political center, both center-left and center-right. That failure, I tried to sum it up in this way, which was that too often our political parties were focused on the interests of them instead of us. And the them was, what about the migrants coming in, desperate migrants from Syria? Okay, that was a them before us type of approach. What about the rights of, say, transgender people? I'm not making a point. I'm a pro-immigration, pro-LGBTQ person, but I'm just saying this was the nature of the politics. And ultimately, democratic politics end up being about, well, what about us? Like the us, however you define it. What are you doing for us? You listened to the Democrats last night, and apart from that one congressman from Ohio, right, none of them seem to be really speaking about the us question. So that's why I think that's one of the reasons why I think Trump had this appeal, that insisted. The central part of Trump's appeal, apart from the anger and the anxiety, was I'm about us. I'm about America first. I'm about the citizens before the undocumented workers first, and so forth and so on. The good news will come when we are able to get that politician who represents a charismatic voice of the center, whether it's the center left or the center right. The problem with the center is it tends to be dull and conciliatory and mushy. The center tends to look like Mitt Romney and Mike Dukakis. But there is a history in which the center can also look like Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. And eventually that leader is going to emerge and save us from our own worst instincts.
Ending on a perfect note, in just a moment, we're going to hear from Karl Rove. The architect is going to lead a conversation. For now, we'd like to thank Aspen Ideas. Thank you, and thank our panel.
So here's what I'd like to do. I had them each draw a number because since we're talking about the future, I'd like each one of them to address sort of what their concept of conservatism for the future is. And so I wanted to figure out some way to get this, and again, relied upon chance. And Raihan is the first. You have written widely about how conservatives should speak to the middle class. Interestingly enough, city dwellers, first and second generation Americans, and college-educated professionals. And you've talked about having the necessity for a unifying alternative to identity politics, which you warn is infecting both broad political movements and philosophical movements in America. And you've said we need a conservative agenda speaking to all Americans regardless of origin, region, or class. And you see this as a question of reconciling egalitarian populism and market conservatism. Can you tell us what that means for the
Holy
future?
cow, you've done such a beautiful job of laying it out, Carl. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Mr. President.
So I have been in the conservative world for a pretty long time now. A friend of mine once joked that there's your chronological age and then there's your movement age. And movement age is kind of like dog years. And in movement years, I'm practically dead. I'm literally hundreds of years old. And for me, a big turning point came early in the Bush years. When I saw the campaign that you ran, it was an incredibly successful, innovative campaign. It was a campaign that really tried to bring republicanism to new audiences. The idea was, look, we have a lot of first and second generation folks. We have this rising Sun Belt middle class. We want to connect with this population. We want to build a durable, lasting majority. That majority has to be a cross-class majority. It has to be a majority that speaks to upper middle-income, college-educated professionals, as well as working-class folks who are aspirational, who want to climb the economic ladder, and want a party that speaks to them not as victims of circumstance, but as people who want to be the masters of their own fate. Now, one of the ideas here is also this kind of Hamiltonian idea. This idea that, yes, we want a limited government, but we also want an effective government that is capable of creating a platform for people. Because when you think about economic change, a lot of the time you need the public sector to kind of carve things out. Think about the Homestead Act when Abraham Lincoln was president. The idea that you sometimes need some kind of organizing principle so as to allow market competition, so as to allow entrepreneurship to flourish. And if you're looking at the 2000s, that was a time when you had new digital technology, a lot of big picture changes that were going to have a big change, big impact on the labor market, and a lot of opportunity to kind of reframe some of how we've been doing things. So that appealed to me enormously at the time. But what happened is circumstances intervened. You had the 9/11 terror attacks, and you basically had this movement away from that domestic focus, a focus on domestic renewal, a focus on the idea of saying that we want a safety net, but we want a safety net that has some fiscal discipline, that's going to be sustainable, and what have you. And I think that, in a way, was kind of knocking the movement off course. And what's happened since then is that you had this group of voters, and I think of this stretching all the way back to Ross Perot, a group of voters who were always floating between the two parties. What you attempted to do is solidify the connection between those blue-collar aspirational voters, cement them into the center-right coalition. That didn't quite happen. Donald Trump represented another attempt at doing that. He did it in a very different way. He did it with style rather than with some kind of substantive agenda, but he did it in a way that really forced other Republicans to respond. Conservative intellectuals always like to talk in abstractions and in terms of principle, but the truth is that when you're looking at coalition politics, a lot of it's built around which groups are organized, disciplined, well-defined, and in a position to influence the outcome of primaries. That's one reason why a populist like Donald Trump was never able to break through. You had Rick Santorum, you had Mike Huckabee, you had folks who were populist candidates, but they could never break through because unlike the NRA, unlike the pro-life movement, there wasn't a disciplined, organized group. Donald Trump did this through TV. He did this through reaching people directly. Now, the challenge is that I think that some of those ideas of a blue-collar conservatism are important and worthwhile, but there's still no organized, disciplined group within the party. You don't have the equivalent of organized labor, for example, to say that we want a seat at the table, we want a bargain, and we want certain policy outcomes as part of being in this coalition. So instead, you have a huge amount of confusion. Republican politicians are terrified. They do not know what to say from day to day, from moment to moment. And a lot of what seems like a lack of principle is frankly more like a level of panic and indecision in the face of the fact that a lot of these folks feel like they don't know their own voters.
Yeah. Well, what do you want that to look like? You want a working class coalition, and you're right. The war disrupted it. We did do some reform things like Medicare Part D, which is an enormously important model for the reform of our social safety net. And we did have some success in the Latino community. But you're right, the war absorbed it all. And by 2006, 7, and 8, it was impossible. But what needs to be done? When you talked about reconciling egalitarian populism and market conservatism, give us a sense of what that might practically look like.
Boris Johnson, leading contender for the next leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, recently made a really, to me, very appealing observation. The idea was that if you want a flourishing economy, you have to have a flourishing, high-growth, private investment, private jobs-driven economy, and you also need to have decent public services. When I look to American politics right now, what I see is a big urban-rural divide. You have about 25% of Americans, about a quarter, living in the 10 largest metro areas. Those metro areas generate about 40% of GDP. They are home to most folks who are first or second generation. If you're looking at Dallas-Fort Worth, if you're looking at Houston, if you're looking at Austin, these are places that are blue islands in a red state. Beto O'Rourke almost won the Senate seat last time around.
We refer to him as Robert Francis O'Rourke.
And of course.
No one can refer to him otherwise.
So what I see is a failure to come down from the level of abstraction and principle, roll up your shirt sleeves, and actually talk about these bread and butter issues in cities. Now, what you see in my hometown in New York City is a situation where there's no column B anymore. There is no Republican Party anymore. And the result of that is that the only thing local politicians care about are left-wing primary challengers. Now, I actually believe that there's room for a column B and that you need a column B because there are a huge number of people who embrace pro-market, growth-oriented policies. Many of them, by the way, are working-class immigrants and second-generation folks who don't vote. They don't take part in primaries. They're not engaged in this process. And I think you need a conservatism that speaks to those folks and addresses them not necessarily in ideological terms. Mitch Daniels, the former governor of Indiana, one of my favorite governors, was very much...
Mitch Daniels.
Of course. Very much a rock-ribbed conservative. Very much a consistent, thoughtful conservative. But he never talked about conservatism when he was giving addresses. He actually always talked about practical, particular problems. He engaged with people he didn't expect to agree with him. He wanted folks who might agree with him on 40% of the issues, and he did a brilliant job of it. He actually had arguments with people in diners up and down the state of Indiana because he actually wanted to treat people as equals, as serious, thoughtful people. And again, he always was coming back to those bread and butter practical issues, and I think that works.
Yeah. He also had a heavy dose of values when he talked about things. He had examples and values. Let's turn to Ben. Ben, implicit in what we're talking about here today is a belief that conservatism is not in a good place. And you've written pretty brutally about this, about what you see as the breakdown of the post-Cold War left-right politics of America. You see it expressed in immigration, trade, foreign policy. You've talked about the power of the corporate elite wielding without check or balance in an increasing technology-driven economy, being a driver of this disruption. You've talked about this being part of a broader global trend where there's declining trust in institutions, and you see this as an inevitable result of perceived disempowerment and disenfranchisement. And you've called for a form of reactionary nationalism. Well, I don't know if you called for it, but you say that a form of reactionary nationalism is what happens when no one trusts anybody anymore. How do we get out of that, and where do we go?
Well, that's a small question to start with, Carl. First off, I just want to say thank you for doing so much work to be in this role of interviewer. I certainly appreciated your interest in all our writings beforehand. Let me just say from the get-go, I am here kind of as an observer of conservatism more than I am a conservative. My own views are quite radical. I have become a lot more libertarian. I left the Republican Party over the Iraq War, and I have no illusions, however, as opposed to some of my libertarian brethren, about the popularity of those ideas. So while I might say my answer to healthcare policy is that I don't believe the federal government has any business doing anything as it relates to it, we should understand the world as it is and not as we would like it to be. Unfortunately, I think that a lot of the conservative reaction and the reaction among sort of the elite commentariat to the election of President Trump has been to wish for the world as they would like it to be, or as they would like it to be again, perhaps as they thought it once was. And I think that that's really mistaken. We cannot, in Brechtian fashion, dissolve the people, then elect another. We have to deal with what they actually want, and the role of a statesman is to try to figure out and lead in those circumstances. I think that when it comes to the broad breakdowns that you were talking about, that I've written a great deal about, we need to understand that they're not just about to go away. These are things that are bigger than politics. They are bigger than any one leader coming along and offering a solution, an agenda that can reach out to everybody in this regard. I think that's particularly true as we've become a more atomized people and a more culture war-driven politics, something that's not going to be changed, I think, after looking at the debates last night, going forward. And so I think the bigger question is sort of what does conservatism look like in this new reality that grapples with it as it is? And the theory that I would advance about that is, in the past, we had a couple of different factors that sort of patched over the differences that were already there. If you draw a through line from Pat Buchanan's 1992 convention speech through the Ross Perot experience in the 90s into the 2000 experience, you then had the force of this war on terror as essentially taking the place of what the Soviet Union once was in holding the fusionist grouping together of fiscal conservatives, social traditionalists, and national security hawks. And that sort of papered over a lot of the different economic problems and frustrations from social traditionalists and others that were existing right underneath the surface. Things that all percolated up over the course of the next couple of cycles. My own view is that the ability of the Republican Party to wrestle with these realities was very limited, and that particularly if you look back to the 2012 autopsy, the only thing that it was really right about is that they were writing about a party and a coalition that was dead. That doesn't exist anymore, and we have to wrestle with the fact that the priorities of the new coalition, I think, are very different, and they care a lot more about some of these cultural issues in ways that aren't just typically the sort of, oh, this is the pro-lifers, this is the evangelicals, and these are the priorities that they have. They often now have very different priorities because they feel like they're under assault, not just from a government that they view as having animus toward them. They all understand that if Elizabeth Warren or any of these other people you saw last night is elected, that they'll all be paying for taxpayer-funded abortions. But they also view themselves as under assault from, increasingly, a group of major corporations and tech corporations in particular who have accepted the full spectrum woke agenda as being what they believe, and believe in a way that is having an increasing impact on the lives of Americans. This is why some of the most interesting people in politics today to me are not necessarily the people I agree with. I mean, I happen to agree with Rand Paul on most issues. He votes against the president 40% of the time. Somehow he still has a good relationship with him despite that, which I find to be interesting. But when I look at the people who are most interesting in terms of charting the path for the Republican coalition and conservatism going forward, it's someone like Josh Hawley, the youngest member of the U.S. Senate, newly elected from Missouri, who has been going at Silicon Valley hammer and tongs, proposing all sorts of methods of going after them on a number of different fronts, particularly when it comes to protecting kids on YouTube and doing a number of other privacy-related things. And also, I happened to interview him just on Monday and for my podcast, the Federalist Radio Hour, and in it he said he views this as a contest between a coalition that is about the priorities of middle-class Americans, working-class Americans in the middle of the country and their traditional values, and a contest against elites within both right and left who have not had their priorities in mind, who have not sought to meet their actual needs, and have instead basically told them to just go along with it.
Can you give a quick answer, because I do want to move on to David. You're a libertarian, and yet you've just endorsed probably one of the, Holly, who has called for one of the most comprehensive programs of government regulation of the internet. Isn't there a little bit of a disconnect between
Of course.
libertarians and markets? And
well, but that's my biggest concern. My concern is that if markets don't speak up, and so the assumption on the part of libertarians, most of them, has always been that the market force will always lead you into a path that is actually going to be more open and more consideration to the old apocryphal Michael Jordan line about Republicans buying sneakers too. But what happens when that sort of profit incentive is overcome by something else, by a different priority that is anti-competitive in the context of ideology? I think that the ultimate answer here ought to be a market-based one and not a regulatory one, but I think it will be regulatory if things don't change.
Yeah. David, I think, drew the number 3, but he should have drawn the number 3 because he's going to, I think, build on some of what you said. David wrote a review in Claremont Review that had one of my favorite George Nash quotes. It's actually one of my favorite quotes about conservatism from the historian George Nash. American conservatives have had no such agreed upon definition of what it is they're trying to conserve. So you've written about what you called a spiritual and civilization fatigue and the abdication of our way of life by the elitist tasked with defending it. You've talked about the reform-minded conservatives, which I don't get the sense you identify yourself as one of the sort of reform-minded conservatives with if the label is reformicon, but you do identify yourself someone who wants to reform conservatism and modernize it, make it applicable to today. And you suggest that they need to, quote, reground their policy agenda to align it more closely with Trumpism, and that you need to look at policy, this new agenda, through a populist lens that pits a corrupt elite against ordinary Americans, echoing a lot of what Ben said. Tell us more about that.
So last year, I think I was the only person at the Aspen Ideas Festival who defended Donald Trump and also said that I was not a fan of Ta-Nehisi Coates' writings. I was pretty sure they would not reinvite me, but here I am again.
You were so exotic, they wanted you back.
Yeah. I don't want to talk about Trump. I want to talk about the nostalgia I see in conservatism. Conservatism, to me, is anchored in gratitude, but that's different than nostalgia. I heard in the previous panel a lot of nostalgia. for a definition of conservatism that was forged under duress during the Cold War to defeat Soviet communism, and that has not really been re-examined in the 30-plus years since Soviet communism collapsed. There may have been a reason to define communism as, you called it fiscal conservatism, Ben. I disagree. It's libertarian free market fundamentalism that thinks that the private sector can do no wrong and the government is the root of all evil. A kind of unrepentant, aggressive, interventionist, utopian foreign policy that culminated in Bush's second inaugural address, in which he said, the aim of American foreign policy is to, quote, end tyranny the world over. Now, some of you may agree with that sentiment, but it is most emphatically not a conservative one. Conservatives view democracy as a rare and fragile flower that takes centuries to blossom, not something that happens when you topple the bad guy. And then the third element is this kind of timid, feckless social conservatism that makes the principled argument and loses and loses and loses. And I want a conservatism that is anchored in the realities of the 21st century, by which I mean, first of all, a conservatism that understands what's wrong with itself, that some of these decisions were made to deal with realities that are no longer present, a conservatism that understands that this is no longer our country. We lost. All of the elite institutions in America are dominated by leftists. Not everyone necessarily agrees with them, but no sensible liberals and conservatives seem to have the courage to challenge the fanatics who run the universities, the Fortune 500 companies, big tech, the media, Hollywood, increasingly the mainline Protestant churches. I want a conservatism that understands that ours today in 2019 is a counter-revolutionary project. That the reason I don't despair is that I think that large majorities of Americans still agree with the things we believe in, but we have no cultural power. We have very little institutional power. And then lastly, I want a conservatism that just looks at the country as it is today and sees, for example, that we need to deal with this great awakening, with this radicalization and deep, deep intolerance of the left. I'm not saying liberals, I'm not saying Democratic voters. I'm saying a segment of fanatics on the left who no one seems to be willing to stand up to, who believe in identity politics and open borders. I want a conservatism that understands that the Mitt Romney approach of dismissing 47% of our fellow Americans because they supposedly don't pay taxes and waxing lyrical in a Randian way about entrepreneurs is not connecting with the concerns of sensible middle-class and working-class Americans. Yeah. I want a conservatism that deals with big tech and does not fetishize markets and the private sector. I want a conservatism that understands that the rise of China is the central foreign policy threat that we are dealing with today.
I thought we weren't supposed to be worried about tyranny.
How so?
Well, you said earlier that we should not go abroad, and the alternative was tyranny or democracy.
I did not say I want to topple the Chinese government and that magically have a Tocquevillian society to flourish.
You do want to work to a point where you constrain tyranny in the Chinese actions
China
around
has
the
been
world.
a tyranny since much longer that Reagan was a conservative. I mean, China has been a tyranny. They're not going to stop being tyrannical. I don't want to live in a China-centric world. Yeah. I want to continue to live in an America-centric world. So I don't accept the dichotomy, are you an isolationist or an interventionist? That's silly. You intervene on behalf of something.
Sure.
It's how you define the national interest.
Yeah, well, I agree, but I recognize that. But I also don't agree that the dichotomy is you can be tyranny or democracy. There are lots of shades in between. There are lots of things that are illiberal regimes or monarchical regimes, things that are not truly democratic, whether it is Taiwan or Singapore, that are nonetheless not tyrannical.
I don't want an abdication of American responsibility in the world. I want it refocused away from nation building in countries that have no democratic traditions to deal with the country that has made very clear that they want to displace us and overtake us as the top dog in the world.
Okay, so we know what you got in the way of a policy agenda. Is the policy agenda, we're anti-China, we're anti-interventionist?
No, not necessarily.
We are declaring war on the culture.
No. We may not.
We've lost all these institutions.
We may need to intervene.
What's the first institution what's the number one thing that you would do if your view of conservatism came about? What is the one thing that you would strive to win?
I want to break the universities. I want to, they have become seminaries for left-wing indoctrination They are not fulfilling their purpose of promoting freedom of inquiry. I am a classical liberal. I do not want to coercively close them. This is a free country. I would like them to be humiliated. I would like the president to do to them what he has done to the media. I would like him to expose the charlatans. I want to do away with this. Oh my God, we have the best universities in the world. We may have the best physics departments in the world. I don't think we have overall the best universities in the world. And then we should defund them. Why is it that we are subsidizing these institutions that are promoting anti-Americanism?
So Inez is next. And once again, the luck of the draw, because her focus has been primarily on education, effective school choice. But it starts with a desire, a concern about the effect of education shaping the moral and virtuous character of students and people. You've talked about a crisis of citizenship and patriotism. You've talked about, in apropos of David, slow burn cultural institutions. And you've called for a positive agenda that focuses on shaping for our politics to prioritize the cultural battles that matter most and coming up with new solutions to hit the left where it is strong. Besides joining David in defunding the University of Texas at Austin, what else are you? What other solutions to hit the left where it's strong do you have?
Well, I think the most important one is a lot of the radicalization that happens in the universities actually starts in K-12. We have a lot of good sociological research that shows that actually what colleges do is they radicalize people and they polarize people. So if you go into university and you're kind of a vague conservative, you come out a rabid conservative, probably from contact with the rest of the university. If you are coming in with a sort of vague left of center view of the world, then you come out basically a trained activist for the far left. And where people acquire that vague left of center view of the world is increasingly in our K-12 education system. And we've totally forgotten why America, a very, especially at the founding, a very limited government society, actually did invest in public education on the state level. And there was a debate about this at the founding. It wasn't, a universally accepted thing that we should open public schools. And Thomas Jefferson was one of the biggest proponents for it, and he reminded his fellows that if, in fact, we are going to have a republic, we need educational institutions that are open to all and that inculcate the knowledge that is necessary for people to become self-governing citizens of a republic. If we look at how our public institutions of education have fared today on that fundamental, basic charge that they were initially created to do, right? They weren't actually initially created to have kids pass. I mean, reading and mathematics is fundamental, but that's not the original purpose of our public schools. It was to teach us how to be citizens. If you look at public schooling today, first of all, everyone has heard the horror stories of the fact that, for example, only 19% of people under the age of 45 can pass the very basic citizenship test that, for example, my father and mother took to become citizens of this country. It's a pretty basic test. I mean, a third of Americans can name the 3 branches of the federal government. I mean, basic civic knowledge is in free fall. And that's no surprise when you look at, for example, the top 100 districts in the United States, the largest public school districts in the United States, and you look at their mission statements, what they put on their websites, what they put on all of their letterhead, you see that college and career come up in the vast majority of those statements. Citizenship comes up in a small minority, and patriotism comes up exactly 0 times, or the word America. So this is no longer the mission of our public school system. I actually think the solution, I mean, we can argue about sort of the 30,000-foot framework for what conservatism should become, whether it should be more liberal, whether we need to be more flexible in terms of accepting government solutions. But I actually don't think that to these very fundamental institutional questions, I have a whole series of proposals that are in fact not new and simply require that Republicans and conservatives have the courage of their convictions and actually act them out in policy, and they're perfectly compatible with liberalism. For the start, we shouldn't be underwriting these universities to the tune of billions in direct subsidies and $1.6 trillion in underwritten student loans. That is a liberal solution. That is not an authoritarian solution. It's not a sort of Josh Hawley wing regulate tech solution. That's a basic liberal solution. Conservatives should stop voting to fund their ideological opponents. And on the K-12 level, the solution is even more liberal. It is give the power back to the families. As David said, our country is not yet in this camp of the far left. That is still a small minority of the country. But what we need to do is grant parents the power over the billions that we spend in K-12. K-12 education in the United States is not underfunded. I know that we have heard this over and over and over again, but we fund K-12 education. We are one of the top per pupil spenders in the world in K-12 education. It is not a problem of underfunding. It is who controls the dollars and who makes the decisions with those dollars. And it is an exceedingly liberal solution to give that power back to parents so that they can give their children the education that they actually believe comports with their values around the dinner table. And I think that's where, if we're talking about where conservatism needs to go on a practical level, we have to wage guerrilla war against some of these institutional
So David
powers.
says defund colleges and universities. You'd make no distinction between the physics department and the sociology department. You'd make no between gender studies and military science.
No, of course I would.
Okay. I'm just asking for clarity on that.
Yeah.
So it's not it's defund the bad parts of the university.
Yeah, it's take a long, hard look at how they're operating, where the money's going. You know, we spend $40 billion a year subsidizing research in our universities. There's no way of knowing where the money goes. We were working with a member of Congress in the last House who lost the seat to get the government to create a website that just allows you to track where this money goes.
Let me ask Inez, you're talking about what is the practical way for conservatives to get patriotism, a sense of history, a sense of civic responsibility, and citizenship back in the schools?
So I'd note that, for example, we've been talking about sort of the death of Reaganism or the Cold War coalition. Reagan, in his farewell address, said exactly this. This is the thing that is left undone by the Reagan Revolution, right? We have failed. We have created a resurgence of patriotism, but we have failed to institutionalize it. We have failed to create an informed patriotism that can actually march forward into the future.
How do you do that?
And so I think the two proposals that I threw out are critical, and I think they need to rise higher on the Republican priorities list. It's a shocking fact that I worked for a while for ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, so I worked with state legislators. And it is a shocking fact that there are multiple Republican-controlled states in this country where leadership has to go hat in hand begging to find a Republican to chair the Education Committee. It is not a Republican priority, and that is foolish. And I think that's something that desperately needs to change.
But even when they get there, we need to recognize how legislatures across the country, and particularly at the federal level, have ceded their power over the course of decades in a way that is very unhealthy to our political discourse. We have a reality now where the vast bureaucracy that has a titular head in the presidency is far more powerful than anything when it comes to legislative activity. The Congress has given all of that power away, and so essentially we end up in this environment where all that matters is the presidency and the courts, and those are connected together.
So David's number one priority is universities. Your number one priority is public education, particularly this sense of patriotism. Ben, what's your number one priority? You're now in charge of the conservative movement, and you can focus its energy and efforts on one thing. What is it? Domestically.
I think domestically they need to understand that they can no longer be the party that defends big business and big banks. And I just think that that's something that needed to change in the wake. I think the financial bailout is something that changed the attitudes of a lot of Americans. I think it's the seed for the populist uprise on both the right and the left. And I think that there needed to be a real reevaluation of whether the priorities of the party were about what those big institutions wanted or what was actually good for them.
So how would you crimp them?
Sorry?
How would you crimp the banks?
Well, I think there's a number of different ways to do that. I just think that if you look at the different proposals that Yuval has put forward and others in national affairs, there's a lot of different options. But I think that a lot of this, too, has to be attitudinal.
These people haven't read. They're not among the 354
But
readers
see, it's the right 354.
So,
let me just put it this way. So much of this is attitudinal. the attitude of the president as it relates to a lot of these institutions goes a much further way than the actual policies that he's arguing for. So he makes claims about tax policy, for instance, and then you end up with a tax plan that looks pretty much what the Paul Ryan, Mitt Romney plan might have looked like before, and yet attitudinally his supporters like it because they trust him on that subject. I think that one thing that people ought to take away from the experience of the last, and I think this is something that Brett Stevens actually had right, which is that there was this attitude that the elites had about themselves, that we know what's best, we know what's right, and these institutions are going to continue to be good for
I got that. That runs through. I've made that same argument. I mean, look, we have gotten to a point where our trust in our institutions is because between the Western Bank of Manhattan all the way to the eastern side of Palo Alto, people who live in that part of the country think that the elites look down on them. But it is not enough resentment and grievance is not enough to build an optimistic and positive movement. Movements that are built around aggrievement and resentment only, or substantially, are movements that ultimately fail. Look at Huey Long. Look at William Jennings Bryan. Look at the Europeans. It only goes so far. And particularly in a two-party system like we have, the party that becomes the angry party is the party that over time tends to begin to lose.
Carl,
let me turn to...
I'm afraid you've queued me up
Yes.
because this is something I think about pretty deeply. So if you look at some corners of the country, the way that our politics works now, as I mentioned before, there is this incredibly intense rural-urban polarization. What that means is that California right now, if it were a sovereign country, it would be the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, an extraordinary place, extraordinarily creative, entrepreneurial dynamic. If you measure poverty by taking into account something like the cost of housing, California has a higher poverty rate than Alabama or Mississippi. California is a place that has the most extraordinary climate in the world. This is an incredible dynamic, again, all these wonderful things, and yet it's failing a huge number of Americans. Now, some of those Americans might be black and brown, some of them are first and second generation, they're Americans. And this is an extraordinary failure. Right now you have cities up and down the coast that have created so much private wealth that are overwhelmed by a homelessness crisis, the likes of which the state hasn't seen it. When you look at New York City, this is another place where there are all sorts of people who want solutions to practical problems around public education and what have you. Now, the thing is that if you are in a primary and you're in a jurisdiction where you have 70% of the vote, whether you're in rural Texas or you're in the most urban of urban districts in New York City, you are not worried about those people in the broad middle who want real practical solutions. You just want to outflank the other guy, actually seeming more exciting, sexy, and dangerous, framing yourself as a dissenter, as bold, as exciting. That's going to work in those contexts, but that's not a recipe for a majority politics. And the way that our system works is that we need broad, overlapping majorities. This is why we have a US Senate. And I understand there are a lot of folks on the left who don't like it, but that's the way the system has worked. It was meant to be something that means you have broad, overlapping majorities. The reason you had such an intense backlash, I would argue, after those first years of the Obama presidency, 2009, 2010, I don't really think it was racial resentment driving it. I think it was the sense that basically the president was pursuing a kind of parliamentary politics in a system that's meant to achieve broad, overlapping majorities. And I think that when you look to Republicans, there's this belief, what we're going to do every now and again, one time we're going to get a trifecta. We're going to get every branch of government, then we're going to ram through our agenda, come hell or high water, no matter what those squishy centrists say. But here's the thing. The nature of our system is such that then you're going to have an administrative state that's not necessarily going to play along. You're going to have a huge backlash to that right at the next election. You're going to get chaos. What William McKinley figured out, what a few visionary politicians figured out in the course of American history is that when you want those broad majorities, you cannot do it by being purely sexy and exciting to the folks in the fringe. You do it by actually, frankly, seeming pretty banal.
I'm sorry, who did you say?
If you talk about China, for example, there are a lot of people who will say that, we've got a wage war on China, who will say, well, wait a second, I'm going to inch away from that. But there are people who say that, hey, we need public investment. We need to see to it that we have an innovation industrial base. And that's going to mean that we want market competition, but we also want to think strategically the way that our rivals are thinking strategically. That's just common sense.
Yeah, we're running out of time. We could go several different ways, but I want to play off of something you said and ask the other three to talk about it. You've made it clear you think that The people, who are the people who are not conservatives today that we need to make into conservatives?
Exactly.
And so you said people who live in cities, people who live in blue areas, people who are first and second generation, and in your books you've talked about college-educated professionals. For each one of you, sort of two questions together and try and answer them because we only got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Who should be a conservative today that isn't? Or maybe do we need to worry about having more conservatives in order to affect the kind of changes that you're talking about?
Everyone who loves America and Americans. So you asked for the positive, that it not be anger-filled. I love this country and I love its people. And I sympathize with Americans who don't look like me, who don't worship the same God that I do, that are not as cosmopolitan as I am. I would wish, and this is perhaps a message for the people at Aspen, you are the ruling class. You are the most credentialed, accomplished people who are running this country. Try to have a little bit more sympathy for people who don't look like you, who cling to their guns and their religion. You don't need to spend all of your weekends with them, but there is such contempt amongst the elites for ordinary Americans. They're not all racist.
Well, watch out. Some of these people are here to watch the exotics, but a lot of these people are fellow travelers with us. And as
You'll find that out after the third drink.
The gray-haired guy out there in the middle of the crowd is the guy who gave me my first opportunity in politics. So he doesn't want to be called one of the elite, Cora Logos.
I agree with David that I think patriotism is a core of what built Trump's success. That kind of positive patriotism that is becoming increasingly difficult to articulate, both because of the education system not informing people, and then because it is also has become impossible to praise our common history without, it seems that to praise our common history has become synonymous with papering over any black marks in our past. That it's impossible to be a happy patriot, to be proud of our common history, to be proud of our common culture, without sort of endorsing every evil thing that's ever happened in America since the founding. And I do think that's been a core part of Trump's message. But I actually kind of want to push back against a little bit about the idea that it's sort of the majority in the middle has not been catered to. To some extent, that's true, but I think what we're seeing now is a backlash to 30 years of politics where the Republican Party and the Democratic Party bounded a very actually small range of actual policy movement. And actually, if you go back and look at, for example, the Jacksonian era, where you had turnout of 80% in every election, these were times of big changes, right? You elected one guy, and things would change overnight. There would be massive policy change. And I think right now, actually, there's a lot of that pent-up energy, democratic energy, that isn't finding an outlet in our previous 30 years.
Inez, I want to have Ben have a few seconds. I'm told to wrap it up.
Yeah,
Ben.
so I just would say I'm actually very hopeful about the future for a lot of different reasons, but particularly because I think people are being forced in this current climate to wrestle with a lot of things that they ignored. Kristen Soltis Anderson is here this week, and one of the things that she always tries to remind the donor class in particular of the Republican Party is that while you might think that ditching sort of the social conservative economic leftism, if you had in that quadrant system the fiscal conservatives who were socially liberal, that things would be great, that's actually the smallest portion of the American electorate when you look at who's there. And I think that this is prompting a discussion that moves more into that quadrant where you have perhaps more moderation on economic issues, you look potentially at the social conservatives not as someone to be ditched or to die off. And that's something that I think will ultimately lead to a more healthy and honest political debate.
I happened to be in Wheeling, West Virginia recently giving a talk, and I got asked a weird question, and I started giving a weird answer. And at the end of it, I found myself talking about how I was sick and tired of people beating up on our country. And you talked about this, and there is an inherent belief among Americans, whether they call themselves moderate, liberal, conservative, that there is something special and exceptional about this country, and that in no country are the people better able to meet any challenge that comes our way than this country. You spoke of gratitude. We ought to be grateful that we're in this country and that we've been given both the opportunity and the responsibility of making it better and of making the lives of our future generations better, hopefully through a positive and optimistic conservative agenda. Thanks for having us here today.